Okay, so it's working. What we were planning to do today was to discuss some of the ideas for the essays and start with discussing the topics. So last year when we were discussing the last week lecture, we did talk about some of the titles and topics that authors chose for their articles. So what we can do is we can go into the papers, and the ones, like, we kind of go around the table, and the ones you've picked, you can kind of comment a little bit about how the title and topic is reflected in the content of the paper. So I've talked a lot last week. So today it's sort of your turn. So who would like to start? So some of you posted some of the papers, and we discussed a little bit. Yeah, this one, the paper, which I mean, it wasn't a paper; it was sort of like an article, which had a title in a form of a question: does Apple's ecosystem lock in users? And we discussed that the topic was well reflected in the article, and the title was sort of giving the clear indication of what the article is about. So, do we often have titles in a form of a question? Yeah. So there is another one which is here, but usually the topics are not in a form of a question. Usually in like scientific writing, you don't see topics in a form of a question, but it's okay sometimes. Most topics are in a form of noun, compound noun phrase, which we discussed last week as well, right? So who would like to start and talk a little bit about the paper that they've posted? So we start at random, maybe from the right side of the table.
For me?
Yeah.
To be honest, I've been a bit sick and I haven't really looked into. It's a long time since I read those papers.
Okay.
It's 2 weeks and I don't really remember specifics about them.
Yeah, but like, so which one did you submit it?
I submitted, let's see, under battery consumption. I posted the boosting the battery life of wearables, the top one.
Yeah. Yeah, that one.
And also.
Yeah, let's discuss this one. Okay. So the title says.
That was a really technical one.
Yeah, and the title kind of indicates that, right?
Yeah.
So the title says, well, I'm kind of a very technical author. I know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a very precise statement, boosting the battery life of wearables for health monitoring through the compression of biosignals.
Yeah.
Right? It's almost like an abstract. You already know what the paper is about, right? So it's a very distilled, kind of well-formulated title, which gives you a lot of information of what exactly the paper is. You have kind of a clear expectation what's in the paper. And also he indicates how he solves you can infer that by compressing the biosignals, we sort of boosting the battery life. It's in the title, right? Yeah.
I also looked at some of the Tesla articles, but the car batteries.
Okay.
And the other ones was let's see, next generation cybersecurity solutions for e-health organization. And under security or health, e-health,
Yeah, this one. So if you compare those two titles, so let's say those two, boosting the battery life of wearables for health monitoring through the compression of biosignals, versus the one which says, yeah, let's say next generation cybersecurity solutions for e-health organization. Which one?
I think I'm more interested in the health perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I've experienced a lot of people that are really sick,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't really tell their doctors, even though they're sick. They're a bit stubborn.
Mm-hmm.
And for some of those patients, maybe there could be some wearable technology that they have to wear and be monitored.
Yeah. So you feel that the e-health one is more interesting as a domain.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll start to read up on that.
yeah. So if we just focus on the title, what are your kind of impression from reading that title? Next generation cybersecurity solutions for e-health organization.
I think it's kind of not that technological, not that with wearables, more of how the companies and how the organization should secure themselves against
Yeah.
More general tips.
Mm-hmm. So there is a phrase, next generation, right? If we take it out and say cybersecurity solutions or solution for e-health organization versus next generation cybersecurity solution for e-health organization, what's the difference between those two titles?
One suggests being modern and then having the next generation.
Yep, so one kind of highlights the being modern, but if you have a title, cybersecurity solutions for e-health organization, would you feel it's a historical review, or do you feel it's also including the current ones?
Could be including.
Yeah, you would feel it includes current ones as well, right? So in a sense, saying next generation, kind of, you would have to read the paper, right? But if you do that, that means you have some old generation technology, which you might be criticizing or arguing against, and then some new generation technology, which you will be describing. You will have a kind of a clear distinction, right? If you're only saying next generation to highlight the modern approach, you could just say modern, right? But then if you say modern cybersecurity solutions, what does it mean? It means nothing, because if the paper is from 1960, it's not modern anymore, right? So, it's a problem, right? So if you just want to highlight something in the kind of time span of research, it's a little bit difficult to do that in relative terms. You have to be precise, right? So you can say 2018 technologies for cyber securing organizations, right? And then if someone reads it in 2040, okay, it's not modern anymore. It's kind of a historical account of what was the technology back then, right? So that phrase here makes the title a little bit suspicious, right? Logically, if you think about it, like, why would you say that? Well, one good reason for that is that you're doing comparison for the previous generation and current generation. But again, it's sort of, you can do that, and some people do that, right, without using dates. But then you have to check which year that paper is from, right? If that paper is from 1960, well, it's all old generation, right? It's not even the current generation. So that paper will not look into the future. But if that paper is from 2018, then yes, this paper might be talking about solutions which are kind of not implemented yet, but upcoming. So, you have questions, right? The title should not raise a lot of questions. The title should be quite clear what the article is about. So if the title raises a lot of questions, then maybe you should make the title simpler, that there are no questions. So I would make the title simpler by cutting off the next generation. I would just say cybersecurity solutions for e-health organization, right? And then I would put something that makes me clear what I mean, what I'm doing with cybersecurity. Is it a review? Is it a proposal for new cybersecurity solutions? What is it? What I'm doing with those cybersecurity solutions. So I would add a phrase here like an overview or a review or proposal for new or whatever I'm doing about the cybersecurity solutions. And that would make the title kind of clearer to the reader of what it is about. The rest is okay. I mean, cybersecurity solutions, that's a clear compound noun phrase, which is pretty cool. And then, we're doing it for e-health organizations, which also is quite clear term, right? So in terms of title analysis, I would say the first one is kind of really well, where was the battery thing? Yeah, this one. What's the problem with the first one? It's quite long, right? It's well written, very precise. It conveys almost an abstract of the paper, but it's quite long. And yeah, it's up to the style. So some people don't like very long titles. Some people are fine. I'm generally okay. I mean, because I read the title and I know what the paper is about, and that saves me reading the abstract. Like if I'm really interested into the battery consumption and biosignal processing, that's the paper I need to read. But if I'm not, then probably I can skip it. I don't really need to read an abstract. But it is a little bit on the long side. But it's kind of hard to compress it. Like if you want to say what the title is saying, it's kind of not easy to say it in a shorter way, right? So you may say, yeah, it's sort of a trade-off, but the author decided to go for a slightly longer title, and it works well, right? Okay, so other titles. Who else wants to analyze their article titles? Yeah?
Sure. It's the one on, it's the CRAM, it's at the top.
CRAM, breaking mobile device memory barriers using the cloud. Yeah.
And then there's also the two below it, the memory management scheme and efficient memory reclaiming.
Okay.
Yeah.
So all of them are within sort of similar domain, and also they have kind of a similar title characteristics, right? They all quite technical. They use technical terms. So let's start. Yeah, let's start with the last one. So efficient memory reclaiming for mitigating sluggish response in mobile devices. Okay.
Basically, they're reducing function calls to the kernel OS. So they're, from what I remember, it's also 2 weeks since I last read that.
Yeah.
But from what I remember, they're basically looking at when you're switching between different applications.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing the OS is doing a lot of small function calls, kernel function calls, so to reclaim small amounts of memory.
Mm-hmm.
And they're looking at ways to basically mitigating that, to saying that, okay, instead of doing a bunch of switches to kernel function calls, then we'll sort of save up the number, like mark the memory that we need to reclaim, and then rather do a big reclaim phase at one point instead of continuously doing a lot of small memory reclaimants.
Mm-hmm.
And that boosted their efficiency.
Yeah.
Which I don't think that comes across at all in the title.
Yeah, that's right.
Actually doing function calls, or like just reducing function calls. And also it doesn't really come across either that they are like producing a new algorithm or anything, which is what they're actually doing.
Right.
I get the feeling that that would be more like, the title for me is just more strategies of doing efficient
Yeah.
memory reclaiming, also from the user perspective, not that they're implementing a new way of doing the current calls.
So the paper is really proposing an algorithm for doing the reclaiming.
Yeah, or that is closer to that,
Yeah.
and it's not something that the normal programmer would come into touch with. It's more that they propose that as a different reclaiming scheme for
OS.
For the OS.
Yeah. So yeah, so from the description of the paper, the title is somewhat not aligned with the content of the paper, right? And then if you haven't read the paper, what are your, like, the other people who didn't read the paper, what do you feel the title conveys? So, like, the first part, efficient memory reclaiming, that's kind of clear. Again, it's a noun, compound noun phrase, good, like, in concise way conveys what the paper is about. And then for mitigating something, right? So they are improving the memory reclaiming because something is broken, right? They say because there is a sluggish response in mobile devices, right? Okay, what does it mean, sluggish?
I still have no clue.
So after reading the paper, you still don't know, right?
No, it's well, it is. But I don't remember that being emphasized enough.
Yeah.
But that also might just be me not remembering that.
So on the just first face value, there is a bit of a mismatch, okay? You have something that is slow and something that is efficient, right? So something that is efficient is efficient. I mean, so if you have something slow, what would you compare it to? To something that is fast or faster, right? But something that is efficient, what would you compare it to? Something that is non-efficient, right? So comparing efficiency with slow is like not right. They don't match, right? Why would you compare efficiency with slow? You would compare efficiency with non-efficiency. Slow with fast, right? So if you say something is slow, you would say, improving or faster memory reclaiming, but not efficient, right? So the two, those two words, they don't contrast each other, so that it kind of creates a dissonance in the title, right? So that's one bad thing. The second bad thing is sluggish is a very vague term, like, is it? Yeah, why would you say it's sluggish compared to what it's sluggish, right? When you say something is sluggish, then something else must be really fast, right? So then how is your efficiency comparing to this super fast thing, right? Yeah, it's I don't know, it doesn't feel right. The title feels a little bit odd. So, if you say efficient memory reclaiming for mobile devices, or for operating system and mobile devices, or efficient memory reclaiming algorithm for operating systems and mobile devices, that would be exactly what you just described, right? And it would kind of be clear what the article is about. If with this title, the title in itself, even if you don't read the paper, feels a little bit odd. So the first part is great. The mobile devices part is clear. The mitigating sluggishness, it just doesn't sound right, yeah?
You say that also sluggish is not a good word in itself because it makes it sound not professional at all.
That's right, exactly. So it's not a word that you would, it's a bit informal, right? It's not the word we usually use with the academic register. So,
however, sluggish is also how it feels from a user perspective, which I would sort of raise as a counterpoint to that the users would, like, sluggish, sure, it doesn't necessarily sound correct in the academic sense, but that's what users would describe that word as. So
that's true, but that would be from the UI kind of perspective, right? When we're talking about garbage collector or memory management, term sluggish is out of place.
Yeah.
If you're talking about responsiveness of the UI, sluggishness might be okay to use, but what does it mean in terms of memory management and memory reclaiming? something is sluggish, like it's not the word you normally use for memory management. Something is faster than something else, and that's it. You use relative kind of comparisons between algorithms or memory fragmentation or something. You have some trade-offs, but sluggishness, what does that mean? That one garbage collector is more sluggish than the other?
In this case, they're talking about it as in like apps relaunching fast, and then sort of the phone is feeling sluggish because the apps aren't relaunching fast enough.
Yeah. So then this title doesn't kind of convey that.
No.
Yeah. So if they are doing the reclaiming in the purpose of boosting the startup time or application responsiveness, then they should be a little bit more precise of what they mean by sluggish response, right? I don't know what they mean by sluggish response. Is it as you said, the app response, or is it the garbage collector response, which means odd, sounds odd, yeah. So anyway, I mean, it's not like super ugly. It's just a little bit, feels a little bit, could be improved. A memory management scheme for enhancing performance of applications on Android. Well, that one is pretty clear, right?
Okay, so what do you think it's about?
I think it's about an algorithm which will improve the current memory management somehow.
Okay.
Either in terms of speed or in terms of, I don't know how, what the enhancing performance is, what metrics they will use for that, but somehow they will compare how it's currently done and propose something that will improve it.
Yeah, because this one talks about basically how fast your app relaunches,
Mm-hmm.
and they look at patterns to see, instead of just doing, so currently the regular Android just uses a LRU cache, so least recently used. They basically, instead of doing that, they propose a more advanced algorithm that looks at patterns at how you usually use apps, so that the apps that you usually use are the ones that are less likely to be, evicted. Because having the least recently used doesn't really work if there's an app that you are predictably reusing, but it always gets thrown out.
I see.
And I don't think that's reflected at all.
No, so that's not reflected in the title.
I would rather say like memory management or I would rather say like a memory caching scheme for based on user patterns or something like that.
Yeah, you could say or predictive or adaptive, and you could stress the launching of the apps instead of talking about memory scheme, memory management scheme, right? Yeah, that's correct. So memory management means more than what the paper is about. Because if the paper is only about launching apps, then it is about launching apps, not about memory management, which might be about fragmentation, about caching, about garbage collector, and so on, right? So, but in terms of the sound of the title, there is, apart from the capital M, it seems self-contained and kind of concise and no big drama about the title. What do you think? What others think? Apart from the fact that it is not really what the paper is about.
Again, that's based on me like now trying to remember and reading over the abstract.
Yeah. Okay, so then the first one, CRAM. Breaking mobile device memory barriers using the cloud. I didn't read the paper, so it's a little bit cryptic, but I say the C stands for the cloud, which they mean, okay, we breaking the memory size limits by expanding the memory to store stuff in the cloud. And I would say, okay, it's about some sort of mechanism for expanding the available storage so that you store stuff on the device plus you store stuff on the cloud, which somehow seamlessly works that you feel like you have more RAM than you physically have.
It's sort of virtual memory over the cloud.
Yeah.
Which is what I would rather go for. Because I didn't think about the cloud in the CRAM thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I went to like memory barriers, and that's actually something
quite
different.
Exactly. So exactly. So they use memory barriers, kind of brings the proper memory barriers in programming languages, kind of connotations, which it is not what the paper is. about, because the paper uses the term in a more informal fashion. You know, a memory barrier has a very strict technical meaning.
That's concurrency.
In concurrency, yes.
Yeah.
Which this is not about, but you can kind of get it from the title, right? If you think a little bit about it.
Yeah.
If you quickly read it, you say, oh yeah, well.
I would still say something just talking about virtual memory over cloud.
That's
Getting
right.
that in there would still be better, and also would probably shorten it down.
That's right. So
like
I
CRAM virtual memory over cloud or something like
that's
that.
right. So I agree that the use of the term memory barriers is, I mean, it's okay, but it places a little bit of a mental load on the reader to decipher what it really means. Yeah.
I read it as well, and my first instinct when I read it, that title is quite sensational.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like they chose the wording because they wanted people to read this.
Right. Yeah.
So, but I agree that it's not necessarily the best thing to do, because it's not as Payman said, it's not as descriptive as saying just virtual memory.
Yeah. Very good point. So, question: should you pick some words which make your title a little bit more clickable? If you can substitute some of your phrases or some of your words with something more controversial or kind of more engaging and clickable, should you do that?
I mean, sure. Well, to a certain degree, because I mean, if you're honest about that in the abstract, then yeah. But at the same time, you actually want people to, read what you're writing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why are you, doing it? If no one reads your research, then you sort of really haven't contributed in one way, because no one actually cares.
Yeah.
Or no one necessarily reads it. So if you actually make a huge discovery and no one knows, then what was the point, sort of? Just because no one wanted to read, your boring ass title, when you could have easily rephrased it with something else, people would click it, but at least they would see in the abstract that, hey, this isn't actually, like, it didn't take me long to figure out that they weren't talking about, like real memory barriers. That was like the first sentence or something.
Yeah.
Sort of triggered me on that. So I'm not advocating clickbait, but you should be allowed to think a bit about marketing.
Yeah, but I don't think so. If you see this title and if you see title breaking mobile device memory size limits using the cloud, it's exactly what the paper is about, and it doesn't read much less controversial or whatever. Like the word barriers here don't really bring that much clickability, right? And size limits would be exactly what they mean, and that would be super clear. But in general, like, you can make your title clickable, but not exactly what. So that's what the news kind of stories are about. They have a very controversial title, and then you read the story, and it's like any other story, right? It actually doesn't have that that aspect that is in the title. So it is kind of not conveying what really the paper is about. So that's one aspect. The second one, okay, let's say everybody is doing the more clickable titles, which you see with the news, right? If you read any news, you only have highly precisely kind of engineered clickable titles. So then what happens is that the kind of a bar of engagement just goes up, and you get a little bit insensitive about how hyped it sounds, right? I don't know about you, but I often seeing a very boring news title get really excited about it. So I have the reverse now. If I have a very clickable title, it's like that's the usual crap. But if I see a boring title, then it's like, yeah, that sounds kind of unusual. Maybe it's interesting. So I get so it's kind of relative, right? You compare always compared to baseline. So when titles were boring and there was one sort of shouty, screaming title, you were like, I want to check it out. It's unusual. But now all the titles are like that. So how effective it is, I don't know. Like,
well, then it goes the other way around now, seeing as you said that you want, the boring ones.
yeah.
So I'll also quickly mention one more because I didn't actually put it up.
Yeah.
But you said also bring in like examples of really bad articles. So
Yeah.
I could probably put it up now because I found one that was. So I'll just put it on the top and you can delete it afterwards.
Yep.
Like if you refresh, there's just one on the top there. Yeah, well that's just the link, but if you click on it, that's the type is just like mobile memory management in Android. That's the entire memory management in Android.
Yeah.
Which doesn't really say anything.
Yeah.
At all, except that it's Android.
Yeah.
And in general, the article just like memory on smartphone or memory in Android 101, sort of the same lecture as you're giving in the mobile course.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure why that article is really there in the IEEE Explorer, because it's sort of too basic for me to sort of justify really being published. Because it's actually 101 of memory management, both in operating system terms and in Android terms.
Okay.
And also the keywords doesn't make sense, so it's like stuff like that. So if you look at the keywords, for instance, it should say that it deals with humanoid robots, which I guess is because they looked for synonyms for androids or something. Because they never mention robots of any kind.
Yeah.
They're just talking about and I've never seen anything in there related to big data, cloud computing, or any of the other stuff from the controlled
So
indexing.
it looks like a bit of a hack.
Yeah.
So they hacked somehow the review process, maybe, to, I don't know. Yeah, big data is repeated multiple times.
Yeah. But yeah, I was just thinking, since you said if you find any bad articles, add them as well, because for me this one seems to be relatively bad.
Humanoid robots, yeah. Okay. So the title, memory management in Android. What's wrong with the title?
Everything.
Technically, it's correct. It deals with memory management.
Yeah.
But not in the,
it's very general.
Yeah.
Doesn't really tell you what the article is about. Android is small a. It's short, but yeah, it's too short.
Yeah, but covers a lot of issues.
Covers huge ground, yes.
And also, I think the best part of that article is where they compare iOS and it's at the end they compare iOS and Android, and it's just like you can actually just see it's like they compare doing like using Java, and then it says Android
yes, no,
yes, no on iOS, and it's garbage collection present at, and the RAM requirement of Android is twice than iOS, and the RAM requirement of iOS is normal. And then the battery requirement for Android is more, and the battery requirement for iOS is also normal. So yeah.
It sounds like rubbish.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can leave the paper in the wiki, and then I mean, having some bad examples is good. What not to do, and why it is bad, right? Okay, so let's do one more. Anyone else? Yep.
The cloud computing one under energy management.
Cloud computing.
Under energy management.
Yeah, energy management. Yeah, cloud
yeah.
computing for mobile users.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's basically a paper that talks about the general issues and problems and approaches to doing offloading of computation. And I feel like at the very least they're kind of saying as in the title. So it's a kind of old article, so it might not be super well updated for today's standards, but at least it kind of went through the basics of the topic.
Yeah, so I read it. I don't read it like the last 2 weeks, but I read it before. And I think even though it might not be exactly the same economics as it used to be, and also the bandwidth and so on, network speeds changed, the core idea is still relevant. So you could update the paper by redoing some of the measurements and some of the analysis costs versus time and so on. And it is still relevant, right? You cannot use the calculations they've done at the face value because they are not, things changed. So the processing capabilities and the storage capabilities of phone changed. The transmission rates changed and the cost changed as well. And you also have different battery technologies and different, even across manufacturers, sometimes, I don't remember if that paper was dealing with it, but for example, we did a study where we compared, we were comparing the use of GPS and the use of accelerometer and gyroscope in kind of location tracking. So, and also the Wi-Fi, right? So you can, for example, inside the buildings, you can use Wi-Fi to kind of roughly say where a person is. Outside, you can use GPS, and also when you using the accelerometer and gyroscope, you can also say, okay, the person was not moving, so therefore it's the same place that it was before. So you can turn on and off some of the sensors. So we were measuring how much battery different sensors consume. So how much battery is the GPS being on consumes, how much gyro and accelerometer consume, and how much the Wi-Fi being on consumes. If you don't do little traffic or a lot of traffic. And it turns out, depending on the manufacturer and the hardware you have, you get different results. So sometimes, for example, GPS was more expensive in terms of energy consumption than Wi-Fi, but sometimes Wi-Fi was more expensive than GPS, depending on the model of the phone. So some of the results you cannot really generalize. It was dependent on the actual hardware you had in the device and the way that hardware was using the battery. Measuring battery is also tricky. Like, how do you use the power consumption? It's sort of all approximate. You have to repeat the experiments and see how much you're draining the battery. So again, it depends on the phone how it reports the draining. So some phones report draining kind of really linearly, and some phones kind of do it linearly, and then there is a collapse, right? So, and some phones, like the modern ones, like Christopher was saying that his phone stays forever on 2%, right? So it goes to 2% quite quickly, but then he can use it for quite some time on 2%, right? And it's just a lie, right? Why do manufacturers do that? Well, if you think about it as a gamer, you want a person to not lose the data that they have. So you want to scare them early enough that they have enough time to charge the phone, right? It's the same with your petrol in the car. When the petrol hits the zero, it doesn't mean you have zero in your tank. You still have some, but it's getting close that you should really now put petrol in your car, right? It's not a kind of a correct scientific kind of a scale. It's kind of converted into a human scale that works with your mind to kind of force you to do something quickly. Yeah.
I think it also does that the other way around. I remember reading about saying that when you charge, it's not necessarily healthy for your battery to actually be at 100%. 100%.
Yeah.
So they'll actually like show it being on, or one of the reasons that it goes so quickly down to 90%.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that it tries to discard some power relatively quickly,
Yeah.
but then it seems as if you are losing battery life really quickly.
That's right. So the in reality, what might be happening is this, right? You kind of linearly discharging your phone by you running some process, and the phone will report this, right? It will say, yeah, we 100% or 99 for a long time, right? And then it will say, oh, actually, here you're on 2%, right? So the middle is like complete lie, right? And this is a lie, and this is a lie, and you don't know, right, where you are, and you really want to sample how this happens, and the phone reports this, and it's like, okay, right? So what we had to do, we were basically testing, like we charged the phone fully. We did use particular sensor until the phone got hit 0, and we got the time 1, how long it took, right? And we repeated it multiple times. So then we could approximate, like reading this curve is pointless, but you can approximate this curve by knowing, like from 100 to 0, how long it took, right? And then how long it took with GPS on, with this sensor on, and so on. And then you can sort of compare it. But like sampling and relying on the reports, the battery management tells you how much you discharge your phone. Yeah, I wouldn't trust it. There is too much psychology going on these days. Maybe in the early phones, they were properly reporting to you the actual discharge. But yeah, but I've seen that as well. So with my new phones, they stay for a long time on 100%, even though I've been using it. So it's definitely not 100% anymore. Cool. So that was this one. I like the title. So, cloud computing for mobile users, can offloading computation save energy? Yeah.
Just to the point.
Yeah, it's down to the point. It's in a form of a question. It's fine. It requires you to connect offloading computation to cloud computing, right? Which you could say it in a sentence, right? So you could say, can offloading computation to cloud, can offloading mobile computation to the cloud saves energy, right? But yeah, it doesn't matter. I mean, they've made the title a little bit more catchy because they say cloud computing for mobile users, right? Some kind of bing bing, some keywords, right? And then they form the question, right? So they put the shiny, sparkly 2 keywords up front, and then the rest, which is fine. And yeah, and I quite like the paper, as I was saying, because the research, even though you're doing it right now and calculating right now what it means, it's relevant even if things change, even if the storage and processing power and bandwidths change, the idea is still kind of relevant, right? So this type of research is quite good, and you should pick, like when you're picking your master topics, something like that. So for example, there was a master topic, maybe Simon talked about it in the game class. There was a student did a study on the driver for the Kinect, which was measuring how accurate Kinect can tell the gestures. So like he was using a particular driver and a particular model, a particular version of the Kinect to calculate how precise were the depth camera and how precise can you kind of register the gestures, right? And it relied on the actual details of the driver, how the driver was giving the pixels, right? And then kind of almost towards the end, or just after he published the thesis, the Microsoft released a new Kinect and new driver. And all that thing went out of the window. That was completely irrelevant, right? So you spend like half a year or a year investigating something, you publish it, and the moment you publish it, it becomes irrelevant because there is a new driver, a new version of Kinect, and all your calculations go out of the window, right? So how valuable is that? Well, it was very valuable for about half a year when the new Kinect was not out on the market and people were using the old one, right? But once the new one was out, yeah, it's sort of not that relevant. You would have to change your research to something that would work both for the old and for the new, so people can benefit from your results even in the new one, right?
But was it just a driver change, or was it a new hardware? Because if it's new
Yeah,
hardware,
it turned out it was just the driver change.
Oh.
So the sensor was basically the same. Yeah. So, and they updated the driver for the old one too, right? Yeah. So then all his calculations on the old one didn't work anymore. So if you tied yourself so closely to the particular version of things, then you have to step out and say, okay, what if that changes? Is my research still relevant? And in this case, in this research case, it is. The fundamental idea of offloading is kind of still valid, even though things change, right? So the question remains, okay, is it still worth offloading or not? And they did kind of a model, so you can feed a new data into the model and recalculate it, and you will get the answer. Like right now for this task, should I offload it or should I keep it locally? Which way I will save money or energy, right? So if you generalize it enough that you can reuse it under different circumstances, then you will benefit from it. So if this student kind of did something kind of where you can feed the actual input independently of the driver, you would make something a little bit more lasting, right? So, you know, so it is a little bit like you have let's say a particular technology which gives a particular result, and then you're improving it because you're exploiting some of the constraints or some of the abilities of that device, right? And that is kind of useful to do. It's just that when your assumption change, the result will change as well, right? So in his case, he was really benefiting from some of the drawbacks of the driver and improving on the results. So he could, with his algorithm, you could get a better tracking because of the limitations of the driver, right? And then the new driver came, which basically fixed all the limitations and was better than his one with the improvements, right? The old one with his improvements. So, yeah, it is tricky.
I wouldn't say it's useless though.
No.
Because, I mean, the process is still there, so others can look at it. So sure, they can't like copy paste the solution into their product, but like some stuff can be generalized and perhaps shouldn't be generalized, and sometimes we are maybe generalizing a bit too much.
Yes.
So seeing someone take the opposite direction of actually working with the actual problem. Sure, you can't copy paste it into it, but you can look at what approaches did it take, etc.
That's correct. That's correct. So I'm not saying it was useless. I'm saying it was useful, very useful for short duration of time, and then you have a less of an impact later, but it's still like the work done was still valuable, and probably what he did was replicated in the new driver. Like we didn't do the study, but it is possible that actually what the new driver was doing what he was doing to improve the old one, right? So he did a kind of some research which was concurrently done at Microsoft, and they came up to similar conclusions and kind of updated what the driver was doing to do something similar. I'm just hypothesizing, right? Because, so it is useful. It's just that when you're doing something, you have this trade-off, like how generalizable it is and how timely it is. So, you know, if you go into this fundamental research, then time kind of doesn't matter. Usually it's kind of very abstract and very broadly applicable to a number of different things. But it has the drawback of too general, right? And then if you go on the other end of the spectrum and you do something very specific for that particular chipset, then again you on the other side of the spectrum, right? So it's a spectrum, and you have to sort of be able to map yourself where you are on that spectrum, right? So, you know, theoretical physics usually goes all the way to the kind of abstract. You know, material sciences, they go like, okay, just write this organization of molecules works this way, right? And that's fine. I mean, it's just a spectrum. So in computer science, it's the same. Sometimes you're working on something that can be reused and cited again in 20 years, and some people rediscover it, say, well, this work is super useful now. Like, you know, this guy 20 years ago had such a foresight, right? And sometimes you publish it, it's super hot for half a year. It's like a lot of people jump on it, and then there is a new thing. You know, people adapt to the new thing, and then this thing becomes sort of irrelevant. So yeah. Okay. So we have sort of discussed some of the topics from existing papers. Any volunteers to give me a day title? So all of you are supposed to think of a title. Oops. So let's go to yeah, let's go to Sublime. I don't want to browse the web. So, any titles for the essays that you will be writing, the first ones? You have ideas already? Yeah?
Monetization strategies for mobile app developers.
Okay, can you say it again loudly?
Monetization strategies of mobile app developers.
Oh, come on. Did I change the keyboard? No. Monetization strategies for
Mobile app developers.
App developers. Yep. Other titles. So maybe we go around. Have you have a title? Not yet. Next one. You can change it. I mean, you know, you don't. It's not written in stone. Like if you decide to change your title later, that's fine.
So for the essays I found, it's like really broad.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if I should like make a title from one part of the, because from the essays I found from like e-health and health and security,
Yeah.
I look at every aspect of like the issues that
Yeah.
can occur.
Mm-hmm.
Should I like make a title and write about one thing, or should I make a title and write about everything they discuss in the article?
So if you were to write about everything that they discuss in an article, then the article would be quite a general overview. So for example, you can say, this is the categories of different security issues we have in e-health and m-health systems, and you can list them and you can organize them. So you can say some are related to users, some are related to devices, or whatever taxonomy you will use, right? But then it would be sort of in a form of a list or in a form of a taxonomy, right? You will not have space to dive into deep discussion on each of those items. Whereas if you select one or one category, then you can kind of discuss it in more detail, right? So it depends whether you want to keep your essay very general and very high level with sort of an overview, or whether you want to deal with a particular problem at hand, right? So if you do it general, then you cannot really, you can only discuss general problems like about, I don't know, legal systems or protection or data protection or whatever that is. But if you dive into a particular issue, then you can kind of analyze and discuss the individual issue. So both are valid. It's just that when you opt for the broad one, you have to keep it broad and kind of high level. You will not have space to dive into discussion on each individual issues. And then if you narrow it down, then it's easier because you can sort of point out some weaknesses or faults of that particular thing. You can discuss pros and cons of that issue at hand, right? So in general, for short write-ups, it's better to focus, but you can do a general one as well. It's just a little bit harder to keep yourself on the general level. You understood? Yeah. So it's kind of your call. Like if you have enough material to write for a page or so on the specific issue, then you should select the specific one. Yeah. Yeah, so we kind of our title work in progress. So e-health, m-health, and security, right? Yeah.
Okay, I must say I haven't thought of any titles yet.
Okay,
So I still have to do this.
that's fine.
I have a title.
Yeah.
So there's two variations because I was first thinking about doing pros and cons of using a framework for developing cross-platform and mobile.
Okay.
So either that or just look at benefits because you don't know if looking at both benefits and or both the good and bad things of using such a framework makes the article too broad or too long for.
But it's for a specific framework or for a hypothetical framework?
And I was thinking more looking at the multiple existing frameworks.
Okay.
And seeing what the benefits are and what then maybe also what the drawbacks of using them rather than doing native development.
Yeah. So I would say for an essay, doing more than one framework would be too broad. It would be too much work. So I would just pick one framework and do pros and cons versus native for that one framework. If you were to pick, because that's, let's say we talking here about an essay, right? Which is a short argument for a particular topic. We could talk about a paper, which is like a, say, 8 to 10 pages article, which is more of a report. And in which case, selecting multiple frameworks would be just fine, right? So if you pick 4 the most popular ones and do it for 4 in like 8 to 9 pages, that's perfect. And then for the master thesis, doing 4 or 5 frameworks analysis, that would not be enough, right? So the master thesis is bigger than doing a review over existing 4 frameworks. So then for master thesis, what you would have to do is you would have to analyze, say, 4 frameworks and hypothesize what would be the ideal framework which would have benefits and the minimum amount of disadvantages. So you would kind of propose something that doesn't exist yet and say what characteristics it would have to be better than the existing 4 that you've analyzed. And that would be a master thesis, right? So for the essay, as I said, I would just pick one and do pros and cons for one. But that's sort of how the scoping would work, right? So you know, theoretically, hypothetically speaking, you can pick this kind of as a topic for doing a master research, but that means you have to review the existing ones, analyze what are the pros and cons of them, and then distill, saying, okay, how can we minimize the cons, and how can we maximize the pros, and what would be the ideal framework characteristics be, and then describe that. And that would be, if you do it very well, that would be, say, B. And if you do a small proof of concept, like implementing some bits of the hypothesized framework, that would be an A, right? Because then you kind of demonstrated some ability to sort of do a proof of concept as well, right? So that would be the amount of work that you can say would be a good master project, yeah, for about half a year, for about 40 pages or 50 pages, yeah. But here we're looking at, I don't know, page or 2 or 3 max. Keep it short, and then analyzing pros and cons of one framework is perfectly fine, yeah. So what title would you say?
So the pros and cons of using a
Using
framework and decide
framework for mobile development.
Yes. So a little bit of cross-platform.
Yeah. Yes. Or cross.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
Or something akin. Perhaps the seeing as people sort of are advocating, developing both for mobile and for all devices using those sort of frameworks. And for me, that just seems insane. So I would also look at perhaps not necessarily cross-platform or just for mobile development, like cross-platform both for mobile and for
PCs,
other devices. Because those are two completely different.
So yeah, we do have cross-platform, and that means between mobile platforms, which usually boils to Android plus iOS, right? These days. The landscape used to be a little bit more interesting. Now it got a bit boring. So in general, do you feel it's good to have only two main mobile market forces, or is it better to have more? What are the benefits that, let's say one of them takes over and there's only one mobile platform? What would be the benefit?
One target.
One target for developers, much easier, right? What else? What else would be the benefit? Standardization, interoperability. Everything works with your friends because they have the same brand. You don't have, oh, I have iPhone, oh, okay, or I have Android. What else would be the benefit? So I also think because it would be only one platform, manufacturers and software developers and other kind of stakeholders in the ecosystem, they will have to differentiate themselves somehow, right? So like Huawei and HTC and Sony, they will have to make phones which sort of are somehow different, and there might be more innovation happening on the kind of hardware level. People these days get a little bit there is not a lot of differentiation. Like, iOS and Android are different enough. And then, in iOS, of course, you have no competition. Like, Apple owns everything, so they dictate how the new hardware works and what new hardware you're going to get. On Android, you have a little bit of a competition. You see that. You see the manufacturers kind of trying to put some stuff, put ANT plus sensors or put something into the device to differentiate themselves from others producing devices, right? So if there was only one platform, it would kind of be probably like Android a little bit more than as iOS devices right now, right? You don't really have a lot of innovation in iOS hardware-wise.
You would get like really software, probably get like software-guided hardware performance, seeing as you only have one system that you have to
tune for.
Relate to. You would tool specifically for that and get a lot of stuff that is now usually done in software than in hardware instead.
Probably,
Probably be a lot faster.
So what would be the downside?
Everything else.
A lot. So in general, I feel that we have less competition and less diversity now than we used to have when we had Microsoft and other players in the market, BlackBerry and so on. Now, all the phones look almost the same. The top level phones, they kind of identical, and the spec-wise, they also are quite identical. So we, in fact, almost have a monopoly right now.
Sometimes the work I found is that sometimes they try to do something new. So, for instance, I really got really fond of the mobile where they had a projector inside it.
That's right. Yes.
So, although it was shit, it was something interesting. I mean, doesn't seem that the market want those things because they
didn't take off, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that's a problem. That it's fine to innovate, but when you innovate stuff that people don't want, and then it's safer to just go for what people will buy.
That's right. Yeah. So then there is between mobile and PC. So there are some things like continuity from Microsoft, and some other efforts to make apps being seamless. So you can have an app which works on your PC, but the same app or equivalent app works on the mobile, and you can sort of continue working from mobile to PC. And Apple is trying to do that. Microsoft is trying to do that. Android is kind of doing it with Chromebook a little bit, but there is a little bit of so this might become interesting in the future. It's not a lot of happening right now, and there are some limitations here. This is already happening. We have frameworks, and we are trying to do that. And then you have between mobile and wearables. Again, that's not huge. Wearables usually have their own limitations. They are still a limited real estate of no UI. The user interface, on a wearable devices has to, by the nature, be different. So that is hard. Hard to integrate that. Yeah, here we can add. We can add and TVs. Same here. And then you have the ones which kind of is universal, and that's super hard. Probably not happening anytime soon. Okay, so but you don't have a title.
No.
Yeah.
So, viability of offloading mobile computations to cloud in 2018 might be too large. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Offloading processing or storage or both?
For mobile computations.
Okay. Yep. Okay.
I got only domain. I was thinking about voice virtual assistants like
Yeah.
Hello Google, Siri, Cortana, Alexa.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like we can discuss this topic kind of widely from different perspectives. So I don't know which perspective I would like to discuss now.
Mm-hmm.
I found one article which was kind of interesting and sensible. It got the title Alexa, Can I Trust You? And I found it valuable because firstly got a history of how everything started,
Mm-hmm.
and then was discussing vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, do I want to go in security? Because
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I'm not good into security.
Yeah. So this one was from security perspective, as the title suggests. Yeah. Okay.
I don't have a topic, but I'm more inclined to wearable activity tracker
Okay.
and mobile health,
Mm-hmm.
mobile application.
Mm-hmm. Activity tracking. Yeah. So yeah, for the domain people, as I said, it's easier to select something narrow, something small, to do an essay on. You can try to do an essay on a bigger thing, but yeah, there is this famous saying that if I had more time, I would write a shorter letter to you. So essay actually is quite hard to do well because it's a short thing. It's much easier to write a lot for your master thesis where you have 50, 60, 70 pages and you don't have to be concise. But you cannot spend 2 pages waffling about general things in the essay to make it better, right? To make it better, you have to spend time to make it short. And to make it short, when you're discussing general topic, general theme, it's very hard because you have millions of different things you have to read about, and you have to select which ones to put into your essay. When you narrow it down to a particular domain, by the very nature, you're not like, what will go into the essay is something you have to find out. It's not something you have to limit, right? And finding out stuff and putting in is easier than having millions of things and selecting which ones not to talk about, just by the nature of the mechanic of the task. So I would recommend for those people who have a generic domain currently to sort of focus on a specific problem or specific thing in the broad context and only discuss that. It's easier. Initially you may see, but there is not much. I just have one paper, or but that's enough. You can write an essay just based on one paper. If you find more, that's great. But the task is for finding stuff that will go into the essay, and that's easier and it's more fun. If you're giving a domain, let's say, okay, I want to write something about AR, and I have a page. Well, you can write about AR for like 150 pages, easy. There is, you just Google it and you have hundreds of articles about AR. Which ones to pick, what to write? It's a hard task. Yeah, you will spend, half a year deciding what to write about. But if you say, I want to write about efficient markerless tracking in AR, suddenly it collapses to a very narrow field, right? There is only a few papers which do markerless tracking. You can find them up, you can find what the limitations are, and write about it in 2 pages, right? So if you narrow it down, it will help. Okay, so next one.
Adoption rate and acceptance of wearable devices.
Acceptance?
Yeah.
Acceptance of wearable devices. Yep. Good. Next.
Non-touchscreen inputs in universal design for mobile devices.
Non.
I'll probably rephrase that if I'm going to write that essay. But non-touchscreen inputs in universal design for mobile devices.
Okay.
Twin of the title. Challenges of ethics in advertisement against kids in apps.
Challenges in ethics in advertising for kids. In mobile apps or in apps in general?
In general.
Yeah. Okay.
I was thinking something along the lines of evaluating challenges of blind deaf using smartwatches.
Evaluating
challenges of blind/deaf people using smartwatches. Deaf, not deaf.
Yeah.
That is a challenge.
Quite challenge.
That'll be tricky. And smart, let's say smart.
I had wearable technology first, but I was thinking that's a bit too broad.
Challenges for blind, deaf, smartwatch users. Okay. All right. Next.
Maybe an alternative source of power for your mobile device.
Alternative sources of power for
Maybe
mobile
one of them.
devices. Source. Yep. Yep.
I guess my work will be connected with the Internet of Things, but I have some doubts about it. But for now, I have chosen software engineering for the Internet of Things.
So that's the working title, software engineering.
For now, yes.
For IoT?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, like, say from software development perspective as a domain. Okay.
I'm not sure about the topic, but I like to choose something about differential science.
Okay.
For example, the preferences of people with special disabilities between iOS and
Yeah. So can you repeat it? Preferential.
of people with special disabilities between Android and iOS.
Of special disability users between iOS and Android. Yeah. Yeah, all right. So you can, any general comments on the titles? Anyone wants to? So we have a couple of domains which don't have the titles yet. So I just take those together. And we have some title suggestions, some working titles. So monetization strategies for mobile app developers. Yep. Anyone hates the title or likes the title or feels it's fine?
Might feel a bit broad, maybe. Because I mean, it's a lot of strategies.
That's right. So it depends, like how what will the essay be about? Like if you go all into listing all of them, then the title might be fine. If you focus on particular ones to discuss why this one is better than this one, for example, you may find out that doing all those comparisons is too broad, right? So the title is fine, but it feels broad. So for the essay might become too broad, but it depends exactly what the essay will be, right? For now, I feel it's fine. And also, you can have an overview of all the strategies, right? It's many of them, but it's not like an infinite list. Like you can list them all in an essay. So it might work fine. Pros and cons of using Tortilla framework for cross-platform development. Yep, that sounds fine.
Yep. I feel like using pros and cons in the title. I feel like that's a bit.
Yeah.
I don't really like that.
No, you can make the title shorter, and you can basically say review of XXX framework for cross-platform, or analysis, right? That means pros and cons. So you can rephrase it to use a different term, like let's say analysis. This is for review. It's again, there are no rules, right? There are better ways and or less good ways of doing it, but there is a creative process involved, right? So, for example, imagine the title which says XSX framework for cross-platform mobile development. You just start here. What would you feel about that title? It's a bit short. It don't say exactly what you will do, but it communicates that you will deal with that framework for cross-platform development. And maybe that's enough, right, in the title. Maybe you explain more details in the abstract, but for people trying to understand what the essay is about, just starting here might be enough, right? So for me personally, that would be enough. But again, it is a social thing. Like, I'm not representative for the whole population, right? So something I like doesn't mean, it's good. And again, it's a little bit up to you how you're gonna do that, right?
But we need to do something that you would like.
That's right. I mean, I'm not gonna be the one reviewing your essays. You will be reviewing each other's essays, right? You can turn it around. You can say cross-platform mobile development using XXX framework, right? And then you stresses the cross-platformness of the essay using the framework as a tool to do the comparisons, to do the discussion, right? You can kind of twist the title around. So there are multiple ways. You know, it's a creative process. Like, it's up to the author to sort of do that. Of course, there are ways of doing it, and I agree that saying pros and cons in the title feels a little bit cheap in a sense. It's not great, right? Yeah. Okay, viability of offloading of mobile computation to cloud in particular year. Yeah. Yeah, one thought I have is that the viability of offloading kind of depends more on the nature of the task at hand than on the technology. So for some computations, it is like, again, it's a spectrum, right? So like, let's say you want to calculate 2 + 2. Obviously, you're not gonna be offloading that to the cloud, right? But you want to do some heavy video processing, right? Even with a good GPUs and even with you know, the support you have, if the video is 4K, your phone will really sweat on the task, right? So maybe doing some heavy video processing for 4K content is like on that side of the spectrum, right? So there is a spectrum. And then understanding the kind of the spectrum, I think is sort of interesting. Like, what, you know, how would you make the decision? How would you judge it? How would you sort of place things on the spectrum? So I feel that is sort of the important aspect, because we don't know it. If the spectrum was well defined, if we have it kind of well researched, and that we have basically some sort of taxonomy of saying, okay, from that moment on, that should be cloud. From that moment on, that should be PC, the handheld device. Then the timingless, the technology kind of makes the more impact of what is viable and what isn't. But it's sort of a chicken and egg. We don't know. And what is viable in 2018, what it means is that the barrier kind of shifts right or left, right? So because of that, I don't think you need the year in the title, right? Because what the year just changes, the year doesn't changes the picture, doesn't changes the spectrum. It just says, today the barrier is here. And if you don't have GPU, it's here. And if you have very little memory, it's here, right? But the picture is the same. It's sort of, so, you know, next year we have more RAM, better GPU, the barrier kind of, the viability of offload just goes a little bit more towards the heavier processing, right? But where the barrier is not as interesting and as crucial as the picture of how the spectrum looks like. So I think if you delete the timeliness, and you focus on describing of when it makes sense today to offload things into the cloud, you will be giving insights into the picture of the spectrum. And then next year or in 2 years' time, the spectrum picture doesn't change. It's just the viability changes, right? So I think, I mean, you can focus on the cost effectiveness of doing cloud offload today, but that's less interesting than having an insight into the spectrum. So I kind of suggest deleting the time, because it's not necessarily the most interesting aspect of the viability, right? It will make your paper, as with the other paper, if you do the calculations today, if someone reads the paper or the essay 2 years from now, the viability answer will be different, right? But the picture insights are kind of the same. Okay, adoption rates and acceptance of wearable devices. Here, I think in 2018 would make sense, right? Here, the timeliness is sort of crucial unless you focus on the factors for the adoption rates, right? So if you're focusing, or you, I mean the author of the essay, if you're focusing on the rates and acceptance rates, then it is a really timely thing. It is not universal, right? If you say factors for adoption rates, then you don't need a year because the factors will not change next year. The rates will change, but the factors will not, right? But if you're talking about the rates, I would need to know when you've done your study or when the rates you are describing, because it is kind of, it matters, right? So one or the other. You can write an essay about the rates, in which case you have to make precise it when it happened or when you are analyzing the rates. Or if you're talking about the factors driving the rates, then the rates themselves are not as important as the factors, and then the factors are universal. Yeah. Non-touch screens inputs on universal design for mobile devices. Yeah, it's kind of concise and clear enough, I think.
Yes, I could take away universal design there and just say non-touch screen inputs for mobile devices.
Yeah, you could, because I'm not sure how much of the non-touch screen inputs are specific to universal design and how much are kind of just general non-screen inputs, right, which can be used for universal design. So it depends on the nature of the essay, right? If you're looking at the non-screen inputs from the universal design point of view of how they can be used, you take them for granted. So you assume there are certain non-screen inputs that the universal design adapts and uses. But it's kind of tricky, right? We don't know that yet. It's not written in stone what non-touch screen inputs we have available, how they are used. Like even with accelerometer, like how it can be used as an input. It's an open research question, right? So maybe, yes, maybe taking off the universal design from the title and focusing on how non-touch screen inputs can feed into the interface is kind of the question we have to ask today. Yeah, it changes the expectation of the essay. If you do use the universal design, we sort of assuming we have something that the universal design will use, and you discuss how the universal design will use it for its universal design. But if that bit, which is the input, is still an open research question, then maybe you have to take the universal design out and focus on that. Yeah.
If I'm talking about specifically for universal design, I should probably change the non-touch screen to like voice input.
Exactly. So you could say voice or audio input for universal design. Then you kind of precisely, we know what the input is, no research there, but how it feeds into the universal design then would become the topic of the essay. Yeah. Challenges in ethics in advertising for kids. Yeah, we could just like rephrase it to like ethical challenges in advertising. Yeah, so I'm a little bit, so the term apps is a little bit vague, right? It's a little bit imprecise in what do you mean. So that you would have to kind of make that like in which context a little bit more clear, right?
Yeah, I think also context is equal both in games and apps or in applications.
Yeah.
The advertisement strategy is the same.
Yeah, that's true. So if your essay is about the kind of advertising strategies, then maybe you just delete that bit, and say ethical challenges advertising for kids. Yeah. Yeah, but then it's a little bit too broad then, because like TV advertising for kids might fit into the title, but you may not want to deal with it. So it depends what you want not to deal with, right? If you don't want to deal with newspaper, magazines, and TV or movie advertisements, but only focus on some sort of games and apps and applications, then yeah, you would have to somehow communicate what is not part of your study. If we leave it like this, it's very broad. You know, TV ads, billboards, and all those things come into the title, right? And if you say, you could say mobile advertising, and then you're limiting to just mobile devices, right? Both games and apps, yeah. But somehow, yeah, we don't want to have a title which covers stuff that we don't talk about. And the very broad one would. Yeah. But otherwise, yeah, otherwise I think it's fine. It will be tough though, right? Ethics is tough to deal with. And it's similar to what I was discussing about the broad topics and broad context versus very narrow ones. Ethics by the very nature is always a little bit broad. So it is a timely and important challenge, but it's difficult to be concise about. It's like when you write, okay, so if you have a broad topic and you have small space for it, it's very easy to do a crappy job, right? Because you will omit important things. If you have a lot of space, it's not easy to do a crappy job because you have a lot of space, so you will include a lot of things, which means, you know, the quality may be bad, but at least you will not forget about important things. But if you have a small space, it's very tough to isolate those important things that have to go in. And when you're talking about ethics, it's the same. It will take a bit of effort and time to make it kind of concise.
If we limit the scope, then immediate actions of how the advertisement works on kids, and the ethics of that.
You could do that, yeah. But that it changes the nature of the essay, right? The one which this one suggests is discussing the different challenges you have making decisions about advertising for kids. What are the pros and cons, and what are the pitfalls, and what are the, like, you know, you had this pony example from Simon, probably you've heard it. So are you taking the serious games class? Yeah, I'm sure he will talk about it. So that there is a kind of a morality, like what's efficient in terms of money making or on profits, and what it means in terms of ethical behavior, and how where you draw the line, right? I mean, the user usually have a choice, but the kid has limited choice because it's a kid, right? The kid is very emotional. All the responses are very emotionally driven, right? So then it's very easy to take advantage of the kid's emotions, right? And advertisements usually do that. They play with our emotions, right? So with the kid, like, you know, the challenge is, okay, where you draw the line, and where you draw the line between the pressure of the stakeholders to maximizing your, you know, revenues versus the being kind of long-term good citizen type of, you know, in a game world or whatever that is. So, I mean, I do like the ethical challenges as a topic because it's a very interesting topic. It's just a little bit hard to deal with it in a small essay format. Yeah, but if you give it a shot, why not, right? Okay, evaluating challenges for the non-living users. Yeah. I mean, it's pretty clear what the challenge is, what the topic is, right? So I quite like the title. I don't think you can make it much better than what it is now. Do we spell smartwatch with the dash or no? Probably. Okay, so alternative sources or source, if it's just one, of power for mobile devices. If it's just one, I would say what it is, right? So if it is, so you either say alternative sources of power for mobile devices and then you discuss them, or if you just picked one particular one, then you just say, you know, XXX as a source of power for, So you could just spell it out like, what it is. Software engineering for IoT. Yeah, that's a working title. It would need to be a little bit more. You would have to say. Is it like analyzing the challenges, analyzing the frameworks, analyzing the methods, like what it is about software engineering? Or is it the software engineering methodologies for IoT? Like it has to be a little bit more narrowed of what exactly the essay is about within the field of software engineering. Preferences of special disability users. So my feeling is that the differences between iOS and Android are less interesting than the preferences of the special disability users in general, right? So, for example, a preference for having a particular, let's say we're talking with, what particular special disability you will deal with, but let's say we're talking with vision impaired users, right? So for example, a preference of having a huge fonts versus having a voice assistance is more important than whether they prefer Android or iOS, I guess, because both will do that. You can either maximize the size of the fonts and things to have, so you can kind of read it, or you can have an audio assistance. And both Android and iOS will do that, but the preference of the user will probably, the user probably doesn't care if it's iOS or Android if they prefer audio versus enhancements of the rendering, right? So I would kind of focus on that. And you can, of course, use Android and iOS as examples of how they do that and whether users prefer the way Android is doing it versus iOS doing it. But there is kind of a bigger picture at hand, at work here, right? And I would probably, I wouldn't necessarily stress that part. Of course, it can be part of the essay, no problem. But is it really important for the special disability users whether they use iOS or Android, or is it more important of how the disability is being helped? And I feel that the helping part is more important, and I feel the helping part is always in both. You can, the disability services in iOS and Android are similar. They tackle similar challenges in similar way. So the nuance there is important, but it's probably not as important. So it depends. I'm not sure whether my suggestions are universal or whether they just kind of my bias on the take on the topic, right? So I would say it's up to you, up to the author of how you want to frame the questions that you will deal in the essay. But yeah, other than that, it's fine. You can change the topics, you can change the titles. You will do more than one essay, right? So it's not super important to pick one particular thing that really interests you. You can, because you will be redoing it, right? And you will be redoing it with the other domains as well. So don't be kind of too paranoid about picking the right topic. It's not your master topic. It's just a playground for playing out with writing stuff, right? So yeah, that's my final comments. Any questions? Right, so we do have the working system. I do have it opened, and you had a glimpse of it before. It's this one. It's called ixc.no. you will have to log in. You can automatically log in with Google account. We don't take anything apart from the oath from the Google, and you can always revoke the access if you want to the app in your Google profile. So that's the most convenient one. But if you are careful of who you let to your Google email oath, you can register with a dummy username and password. And the username is actually an email, but we never check it. So it can be a non-existing email, right? Just for you to know. But it has to be in a form of an email, right? We may be using that email in the future for something, for like, yeah, but we currently don't, and for the duration of the course we will not. So we don't verify that email neither. So it's up to you to use a real email or imaginary email. But then you have to log in yourself. And when you do, use your real name, because other students would like to know who is who. So don't, even though you may use a fake login, use the real name for other students to know who is who. The feedback is anonymous, so then the actual login and name is not used for the feedback, but the authorship of the essays is known. And usually you have to link whose essay is it, right? So like for me also, I need to know who wrote that essay, right? So use some sort of real identity so I know who wrote what. When you're giving comments and when you're giving suggestions, that information is hidden. So nobody really know it, and I don't know it when I'm using the system. I can decipher it from the database, but normally it's not visible. So for the sake of commenting on somebody else's work, that who is commenting is not shown. So you can either use this. Most people last year used the Google login. As I said, you can revoke it at the end of the course, and then the app will not have link to your account anymore. And you will be logged out. So if you're using this one, you will have to type in your password and you kind of re-authenticate yourself. With this one, it's just 2 clicks because it just re-establishes the oath with the Google service. So yeah, up to you. And then once you do that, so if you quickly do this, so if I quickly log in as myself, what you will see is that it doesn't refreshes, right? So sometimes you have to like click this again for the UI to refresh. It's a limitation of the Angular. If you can patch, by the way, this is an open source project as well. You can browse the source code. So if you see some glitches, you can submit the pull request to fix them, right? So don't tell me something doesn't work. Just fix it, and then I will fix it. So there is an essay tab, and then you have, you can, because I'm an admin, I can see everybody's essays. I don't think without the admin, you will see that. And then, yeah, Mile last year, he logged in with his Google account, so we pulled his picture as an icon. And then you sort of see, like, you will see the essays of other people in the class. You will not see the historical essays, I think. We will work it out. This is the module which was written by some of the, this module was written by previously. This module has been written by the integration project of some students. And we have the ability to link the essays with the references, with the actual articles. So do use it. So then if more people are citing a particular article, then we can have statistics of how, and it is kind of linked. So you have multiple comments and multiple essays going to the same paper. And then the paper is linked to particular essays. So when you're citing something, kind of look up if somebody already edited that paper, article. If they didn't, then you do that, and then other people can link to it. More or less, it's sort of we will use the essay and article modules. We will not use the events. But we will use events because I will have a class where all the essays are part of that class, right? So what I will do is I will post a link to this class for this semester, and then you will create your essays under that module, right? So then you can see each other's essays, and it follows. So it will be kind of rooted in the course for this year. all the other essays were routed for the course for last year. Do you get the idea? Yeah. So what I will do, I will post the link to the new class, which I haven't created yet, and then you will have a button that says new essay under that class.
Is that how can we edit the essays as much as we want, or is it like you hand it in once and then you can't edit it?
You can edit it as much as you want.
Okay.
Yeah. So once you open an essay, I have to double check it because I'm an admin, so I have some things that students don't have. So I can do that. I'm not sure if normal students can do that, but I believe as an author of an essay, you can do that. So we can check it. But if it doesn't work this way, it should work this way. So as an author, you should be able to edit your own essays. Yeah. Okay, so that's it for today. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the topic.
Just wait a second.
Yep.
I stopped.